Today, I'm going to put to rest some of the misconceptions that transition and gender ideology has just recently come on the scene. This isn't the case, and I'm specifically going to talk from my perspective and what I consider my group's perspective, and that is lesbians. This is lesbian content for the most part. For lesbians, transitioning has been a thing for a very long time. I've personally, I'm 43, and I personally first heard about trans men and transition from my butch friend group in my early 20s. Suddenly, it just seemed like out of the blue, seemed like really overnight, very quickly, a bunch of my friends who were butch, like myself, started to identify as trans men. And it really spread through the community very quickly. And this was in 2001, 2002. Now, where does this come from? There's a lot of lesbians out there that'll say, oh, I've never heard of such a thing. It wasn't a thing when I was that age, blah, blah, blah. Maybe it wasn't where they were. And this is an important point. Depending on geography, that may be true. You might have never heard about transition or seen trans men or heard about any of that as early as, say, I did. I was born and have grown up in California. I still live in California. I live about 4 or 5 hours away from San Francisco. The trans stuff really did come out of San Francisco, and there's a whole history as to why that is. I will put it as brief as possible. The big reason that a lot of trans stuff came out of San Francisco is because a lot of homosexual and gay people and that whole kind of atmosphere came out of San Francisco. A lot of gay people ended up living in San Francisco. One of the reasons that San Francisco became such a gay hub is because during World War II, the United States became very, very open with letting everybody join the armed services, right? Because they needed the help, right? And that used to be a very, very strict policy against homosexuality in the military. However, they needed bodies, and so the American government looked the other way when it came to letting homosexuals in, for the most part. However, if you were found out to be homosexual real blatantly, or at the end of World War II, when they had a whole bunch of homosexuals that they needed to get rid of, policy was to just dump them off at the nearest port. And so San Francisco was a major port. And so a whole lot of homosexuals got dumped off in San Francisco in the 40s. And where were these gay people going to go? They probably weren't going to go home, right? Big city is probably a little easier to get around in. And if you have a whole bunch of you there, you're probably just going to group up. You're a minority, you're a hated minority, you're a persecuted minority. You can read about this in Odd Girls and Twilight Lovers. It's a book by Lillian Fatterman, and I'll put the link to her website. It's a history of lesbian life in the 20th century America. And she talks about this. She talks about a whole lot of lesbians being dumped off in San Francisco. Okay, so that's how San Francisco became a gay hub, is because all the gay people who joined and put their lives on the line for the United States government got kicked out and dumped at the nearest port because they were gay. All right, so San Francisco was a hub for gays and lesbians. And the other part of this history that I want to make clear, because I can already see comments coming in which have already happened, people blaming the LGBT for bringing the trans shit in. And it's like, to be honest, this isn't everybody problem, because trans stuff wouldn't have gotten nowhere if an extreme minority wanted it to get somewhere. It had to get somewhere because a lot of people bought into it. And the basic idea behind the belief in trans, it's pretty much based on a sexist and homophobic stereotypes, which the vast majority of our society buys into, both gay and straight. So let's not point fingers. Let's just understand the history. So another piece of the history with homosexuals, homosexuality has always been lumped in to the category of sexual deviance, and mental illness and things like that. So homosexuals have always been lumped up with, transvestites, or um, men who like to pretend they're women, um, because it sexually arouses them. Autogynephilia, which is the term that's been coined for that. Um, Even pedophiles, any basically sexual deviant of any kind, like homosexuality was dumped into that lump, right? By academics, by doctors, by mental health institutes, hospitals, everything, right? Gay people used to be put in mental health, or mental asylums, mental illness asylums, and given horrible treatments. So we were lumped in with sexual deviance. So because you're lumped in with sexual deviance, because you're living in one place and you're all in this one group, it kind of makes sense that, like, trans is going to kind of come out of that soup a little bit. It's going to thrive in that soup, right? And also keep in mind that if you're a minority who is, getting the shit kicked out of you by cops and getting beat up, getting harassed, getting thrown at, being persecuted on the streets, losing your job if you're found out to be gay, your community that you have isn't probably going to want to cause any problems. Like, at least, even a little bit I remember from the late 90s and early 2000s, we put up with some creepy straight people in our, we knew they were creeps, right? But we put up with them because we're like, ugh, I just don't, we don't want to rock the boat. We don't want to cause any kind of chaos. We don't want to bring attention to us. So we would put up with some undesirable folks in our group because we were undesirables as well. Like, that's just kind of like, that's human nature. I'm sure people much more intelligent than me can understand and explain this further. But, so that's kind of why sexual deviance kind of might kind of coexist there a little bit with homosexuality, even though homosexuality is not a sexual deviant, and homosexuals aren't child molesters, although that gets linked up a lot too. But you got to understand the history of how these things became linked up and why they're linked up. Okay, so these things are linked up. San Francisco is a hub for this. In the 90s, especially, you started to see a whole lot of activism happening, especially because of the AIDS crisis. And from what I can tell, it definitely is this rising of trans activism does really come along with access to the internet. I mean, it spreads the knowledge far and wide. A lot of transgender activism was already happening online in the 90s. So in San Francisco, with a big city like that, where a ton of people are congregating together in a very tight space, any social idea, social contagion, any kind of thing that's happening is going to spread like wildfire. So the trans stuff already was in San Francisco in the 90s, probably earlier, but definitely in the 90s, late 90s. And you already had lesbians transitioning in mass by the early 2000s, by the late 90s and early 2000s in San Francisco. And I think California would have been hit with it much more earlier, because California has basically two really big cities that are kind of hubs for the rest. And San Francisco Bay Area is one and LA is the other. Both San Francisco and LA had a whole lot of the trans stuff happening in the late 90s and early 2000s. And if you're from a more rural area like I was, and you have a smaller gay community, the overlap between rural gay community in California and big city gay community was definitely happening, especially if you use only a couple-hour drive. It was very common for us to go up and spend the weekend, or go up to Gay Pride in San Francisco, or go live. A lot of gay people would go live in San Francisco for a while and come back, or, so there was a lot of cross-culture pollination happening. So I heard about transitioning in 2001, or 2002, probably around there. So I heard about transitioning, and that's when it really started to spread. And I have proof that this was a thing. So I will drop the link to the article. There's a couple articles actually. So there is the one of the first articles that I found, and there's probably more, but this is kind of like a big one that you can Google and just kind of pops up. It's say it's from 2003, and it is from the San Francisco Gate. It's called "Straddling Sexes: Young Lesbians Transitioning into Men Are Shaking the Foundation of the Lesbian Feminist World." This was published in June of 2003. I was 23 years old. And so think about that for a minute. If this is getting so common and so known that it's published and a pretty major source talking about this, you know it had to be big. It was definitely becoming a thing. It was definitely a thing. So this is not new to lesbians. Trans stuff has been, in my opinion, devastating to lesbians. And I don't I could say lesbian community as a shorthand for lesbians, right? Because to be honest, there's no lesbian community necessarily. Communities break up into many different parts depending on geography and depending on city and culture and all those kind of things. Um, Lesbians that really got into radical feminism, for example, and maybe lived a more separatist life, probably would have never come across this, right? Lesbians that lived in the big cities and were very active in LGBT activism and community definitely would have heard and seen this stuff much earlier. So your mileage may vary. But in this article, they talk about how so many formerly butch identified lesbians are suddenly transitioning. So I'll just read a little bit here. What's that? Rocco? I'm not sure how you say that. Has agreed to meet me at a Mission Street cafe. She is 23 years old, a hip hop musician, and an FTM, a female to male transgender person. Born female for the last 2 years, she has been injecting male hormones. Although unlike in the evolution of a transsexual, I'll just use their words, his gender change will not include genital reconstruction. I've yet to meet this person, so each time someone pushes the door, I make an assessment. Male, female, K. I'll say K because I don't know how to say that name, so I'll call this person K that the reporter is going to interview. After only 20 minutes, it becomes clear why the notion of two genders has become so limited. I can hardly tell who is what, or was born which way. Let's see. Bald African-American athlete, settled in with a newspaper, looks female, but under those sweatpants. Could just as easily be male. Over in the corner, the chubby white person in a basketball hat, hunched over a laptop playing solitaire, seems male. But with a second glance, I get she is female. I simply can't tell about I simply can't tell about two Latino youths at the next table, tattooed, pierced, and mostly beardless. Kay arrives wearing a trucker's cap, retro cowboy shirt, and baggy jeans. He looks like a cute teenage boy. It's easy to see why a group of sorority girls at a Midwestern university where Kay recently performed were freaked out to find out he was born female. They found him cute too. So let's see. Kay, whose male name was chosen by his Greek-Italian parents, began his journey towards manhood 4 years ago. 4 years ago. This is 2003, so 4 years ago. At first, he figured he would enter into what is being called the realm of genderqueer, or third sex, someone neither male nor female. Remember this? This stuff was already happening back then. This isn't new. At the beginning, I was a dyke that wanted sideburns, he says. Now he finds himself less and less identified with the lesbian community and more walking through the world as a man. He is often called sir or buddy or son. Kay, as a feminist, says the entry into the society of men makes him somewhat uncomfortable. Can I just stop for a minute and say, this is such a fucking thing with those of us lesbians who transition, right? Is such a thing, right? Because we know we're not stupid, especially if you're gender nonconforming, butch, masculine, whatever. You've been getting the shit kicked out of you pretty much your whole life for being a woman who's not acting like a woman. You see the misogyny, you see the sexism, you experience it every day, right? Even if you don't call yourself a feminist, you cannot not be a feminist in a patriarchal society that values maleness and men above femaleness and tells females they must act a certain way. Okay. So you know this, right? And then when you cross over, you start taking those hormones and you cross over that threshold to being looked at and identified as being male by vast majority of people. It's a mind fuck, right? And you really struggle with this because you're like, at least for me, I was like, oh, I get treated way better as a man. That's pretty fucked up. That probably had a real damaging effect on me as a lesbian and as a woman. But you're having this cognitive dissonance, and the struggle because you want to hide behind your beard, but you also want to do what's honest and right. And even though you don't identify with a lesbian and lesbian community and lesbian women, that is what you are. So you've separated yourself from your community, really, and you'll never be male, and male community will never exist for you. You can never fit in there. And so you're in no man's land. And it's a very strange kind of very messed up place to be. And this is such a lesbian experience, a lesbians who transition experience right here. Okay. As a feminist, says the entry into the society of men makes him somewhat uncomfortable. Though he is now afforded certain male privileges, he finds himself in the quirky position of becoming a man-hating man. Yes, experience the same thing. It's like being inducted in an underground society, he says with due seriousness. My responsibility is to become a decent man. God, I gotta tell you, I thought the same thing. And I never read this article before. I only read this article like a year ago. It's just, it cracks me up how it's funny and sad all at the same time, how similar all our experiences are. If all of our experiences are pretty much goddamn like by the textbook similar, write it down and it will just match like 99% of our experiences, then that's something to pay attention to. That's not anything to look away with. Ask why. Again, women doing emotional labor. My responsibility is to become a decent man. It's a woman's responsibility to become a decent man. Let that sink in for a minute. You know what I say to that now? No, it's not my responsibility to do shit for men at all. It's their fucking problem. But that's because I am one of those horrible radical feminists. A boom in the number of people transitioning from female to male, referred to as FTMs, has been stirring up controversy even within the lesbian community. There are those that are feeling curiously uncomfortable standing by as friends morph into men. Sometimes there is a generational flavor to this discomfort. Many in the over 40 crowd feel particular unease. Having lived through the fiery feminist years, when challenging male power was central to a particular agenda, some lesbians have gone so far as to say they feel betrayed by those transitioning. I get that feeling. I understand that feeling. It's a completely valid feeling for lesbians to feel. 20 years ago, life as a butch lesbian seemed the obvious path for a masculine identified gay female. Now, young lesbians immediately enter a community in which the option to change genders is readily available. Remember, this is 2003. All right. I'm going to stop there. I will link the article and you can read the article in full, but I think it's very eye-opening. And I think lesbians especially, older lesbians, maybe lesbians who weren't in this, need to understand that this was happening in some communities, some areas. And the internet just made this spread like wildfire. You know, this came out of San Francisco. San Francisco is a big place. This came out of a huge community that exists there. A pretty well-educated community too. There's lots of higher learning institutions of higher learning in San Francisco that really can put this crap out into the world. Academics, a lot of I would say probably a lot of middle to upper class to rich kids are coming out of here. They have the money, they have the access to the internet, which, you know, wasn't back in the 90s. You had to have a little money to have a computer and access to the internet, you know. So this was going to be people who had money. And this allowed this stuff to spread wildly. So that's one article. And then there's another article that was published in 2006 in the New York Times. It's called "The Trouble When Jane Becomes Jack" by Paul Batillo. August 20th, 2006, San Francisco. In the most recent season of the lesbian soap opera, The L Word. Who remembers The L Word? That was the biggest piece of shit show. A new character named Moira announced to her friends that through surgery and hormone therapy, she would soon be a new person named Max. Okay, so 2006, the L Word starts doing this shit, right? Again, remember what I'm telling you. The L Word came out of LA. LA and San Francisco, huge hubs for this shit. The L Word was then made, and then what did it do? Propagated this idea to the masses. And if you were a lesbian, you watched the show. I was like 24 or so when the show came on. I would have been 26 at this time. I watched the show, even though I cringed a lot. It's like you watch what's available because nothing's available to you. So I watched the show. I think I watched maybe 2 or 3 seasons, and finally it just got too fucking crazy for me. And I was like, this, you know what? I'm going to call this a shitty show. But it was a phenomenon. Like, it was, I remember they would play it at the gay bars. So this propaganda got spread to lesbians far and wide. So, yeah, I remember Max. Max was actually the most butch character on that show too, which was even just a fucking double punch, man. Because that show like claimed to have, like, I think their butch character was not butch at all. It was hilarious. She like wore makeup and skimpy little outfits. Typical fucking LA dyke shit, you know. Any who's been through any kind of like not from LA lesbian who's been to LA knows what I'm talking about. The lesbian community there is very much its own thing. So Max was like seriously like the butchest fucking like lesbian they had on that show, and they transed her. So it talks about, you know, the show. It talks about conflict that's raging in some women's colleges over the whole like loss of lesbian, loss of butch women. And you know what's funny is in these articles, since I think the trans advocates don't quite have all the money behind them yet and don't quite have the power they have, these things were published in I think a more honest way. And so I think that's another reason to read these, because these give a more honest like look at what was happening and what is still happening. Let's see here. Beyond the political implication, the sense of loss is felt most keenly in personal relationships. And that's something I haven't talked too much about because it's very close to home. And I don't really know if if it is my place to say much about how this impacted my wife, or how this impacts the women in our lives if you transition. I think it's one of them needs to speak up and talk about it. And I hope some women do eventually one day talk about their experiences with this, because I think it needs to happen. See, I am a lesbian because I'm attracted to women and not to men, said a 33-year-old woman who broke up with her partner of 7 years, Sharon. When Sharon became Shane, the woman who asked to be identified only as Nastasia, or who asked to be identified only as Natasha to protect family members who are unaware of her lifestyle, said that she was ultimately faced with the reality of her sexual orientation and identity. I decided I couldn't be in a romantic relationship with a man. Well, I mean, the truth is she still wouldn't be. You can't change sexes, but I think, she just, I'm like, well, this is my opinion. I think she is putting, I think what she's really trying to say here is that she doesn't want to be in a relationship with a self-hating woman, or a self-hating lesbian, which is what the situation is. And I think that if you are in a lesbian relationship and your partner tells you that they're going to transition, yeah, I really think the best thing for you is to get out of that relationship. Leave them. They got to figure their shit out. It's not a healthy place to be. Let's see, talks about the transgender movement among men is at least as old as the pioneering surgery that turned George Jorgensen into Christina Jorgensen in 1952, which is very widely published too. Among women who wish to become men, though, the movement has gained momentum only in the last 10 years, in part because of an increasingly sophisticated surgical options. The availability of the internet's instant support network, and the emotions raised by the 1999 movie Boys Don't Cry, based on the true story of the murder and rape of Brandon Teen, a young Nebraska woman who chose to live as a man. She was a butch lesbian, and yeah, she probably tried to pass as male most of the time to be safe. And I remember watching that movie at 19, even before I came out. And let me tell you, it did not help me feel okay with being a butch woman. It made me feel, real fucking vulnerable and scared, because I'm like, I was already getting a lot of shit for being butch and a woman, and I'd already came out of a environment of child abuse and had some close calls with men already, with like sexual assault and stuff. So I was already very well aware of the situation for women, and that movie just fucked my head up, man. And I wonder how many lesbians my age saw that movie and went, fucking hell, dude, I don't want to go down that road. Again, I think it's propaganda. I'd love to know all the money behind all of this. I really would. I haven't gone down that path too much yet, but I think there's, yeah, I wouldn't be surprised if there is some shenanigans back there. Oh, so here, this article is saying that last 10 years. All right, so that's the 90s. Okay, we're going to say the 90s really hit the lesbian community. This is something we've been like struggling with for a while. It's something that butch women have been getting thrown at them for a while. And it's also something we do to ourselves. So, I think this is what complicates the situation. It is something that's done to you and you do to yourself. It's bizarre. It's a bizarre thing. So yeah, I will also post a link to this article, which is behind a paywall, but I will post a link to one of those little sites that lets you get around the paywall. I'll also post some links to an article about early online trans activism, because I think the online thing is really important. Even this article mentions it. And I also will put a link to LGBT timeline San Francisco, which kind of gives you the LGBT timeline in San Francisco, which kind of we'll talk about some of those things I mentioned. So yeah, I basically just wanted to kind of point out, and give a little proof to what I've been saying for a long time. Like since I started my detransition and kept hearing, oh, it's a young person's game. Oh, the young people. Oh, the young people. And I'm like, that wasn't my experience, though. This has been around for a really long time. Like I heard about it when I was in my early 20s. And I know of women older than me who transitioned earlier than me. So, you know, what are people talking about? But I mean, it's fair, I guess, if I mean, the vast majority of people aren't lesbian. And so they're not going to care what happens to lesbians necessarily, but that's why I'm speaking to lesbians. I think as lesbians, we should care about this. We should care about the history. We should care about where this came from. We should care about what it's saying, what it's telling us. We should care about the money that might be behind it. We should care about these things. We shouldn't just blindly walk in and say we're going to be supportive. We should critically analyze and logically think about this stuff. And I'm going to do another video about the logical fallacies that exist so much in the trans argument. But I will end the video here on this particular subject. I hope you found it interesting. And there's going to be more of this kind of stuff to come because I kind of want to put this information out here. The whole point of me doing this is to put out the other side of the information that maybe has not been really thought about and talked about.